before we get ahead of ourselves.
Right.
Help the one that didn't go to any form of medical school here. All I know about menstruation is what I've read on the internet. So, Menstruation 101.
Yeah.
Dante, tell me what I need to know.
Sure. So this, there's no easy way to break down the menstrual cycle or the menstrual cycle, depending on which dictionary you look at.
Yeah.
Not a real fun way to break it down. There's a lot of complex terminology, but the purpose of breaking it down a bit is just to, hopefully shed light, help you recognize some terms that eventually Joey will get to when we're talking about treatments and sort of the ins and outs of the condition specifically. So we want to talk about all of the aspects of the cycle, because with respect to treatment, you'll see the inextricable link there.
Yeah, because PMDD is when, it isn't exactly even true, but when something is going wrong. But menstruation is normal and healthy and supposed to happen. So what is the typical process as it should be happening every single month?
Yeah. So firstly, if we look at the purpose, it's the body's natural cycle involving the female reproductive system, obviously.
Right.
That allows for theoretical pregnancy to be possible. So that's the overarching purpose.
Right.
It's preparing the body for pregnancy. If there's not pregnancy, the cycle spins on.
Right.
So looking at the cycle globally, so it is the menstrual cycle, but it's technically broken down into two separate cycles.
Okay.
And those cycles are also inextricably linked. They're happening simultaneously. And, so it's more for the constraints of the conversation that we break them apart. But they're happening in tandem. They feed off one another. There's overlap. So we'll just kind of break down some of those terms.
Okay.
So ovarian cycle, uterine cycle are the two main cycles within the menstrual cycle. Within the ovarian cycle, we have the follicular phase, which is days 1 to 14, theoretically.
Okay.
And then the luteal phase, which is the second half of those theoretical 28 days. And we'll talk about what a normal cycle is and such in a little bit. So 2 parts, the ovarian cycle, and then we have the uterine cycle, which is talking more about the physical changes. So when you hear uterine, you're thinking about the uterus, the endometrium. And so those are reflective of the period and all of the things that physically are taking place beginning, middle, and end of the cycle.
Okay.
And so I should mention then what the ovarian cycle sort of encompasses. So that's referring to the hormonal changes and things that are happening with the ovaries and the, ultimately the release of the egg and such.
Right.
So that's sort of the quick and dirty, the overview.
So what's the first, when do we start counting? Day 1 is when the period begins?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
So you're saying the first 14 days are you said ovarian cycle, and then the second 14 are the uterine cycle.
Yes. And so if we even look at that as, even one more step above, we can just look at those as pre-ovulatory and post-ovulatory.
Okay.
So,
because about 14 days is when ovulation takes place.
Yes. Theoretically, like day 14, 15-ish.
Got it.
So yes. So that's the broad overview. Now, when we look at when a cycle begins, for a woman, cycling begins during puberty.
Right.
And so this is menarche that you may have seen. That's the technical terminology for the first instance of bleeding. And then it'll eventually end. The cycle will eventually end at the onset of menopause. And so that's typically, maybe 40s or 50s. And that's categorized by about like 12 months or so without menstruating.
Okay.
And so we mentioned the 28 days. 28 days is the average length of cycle, but it can range anywhere from 21 to 37 days. It can range from 20 to 35 days, depending on which, kind of resource you're looking at. And I would be remiss not to mention, so that's what's happening with the ovaries. That's what's happening with the uterus. There's a ton of stuff in between there.
Sure.
But all of this sort of gets kicked off with how it interacts with the brain. So the brain is signaling all of this to go on. And so specifically, we're looking at the hypothalamus and we're looking at the anterior pituitary gland. And so those are kind of sit right beneath the brain. They trigger a bunch of hormones to release. And then next thing you know, you have change is occurring at the level of the female reproductive system.
Okay, so you said they're at the base, at the below the brain. So right, the two lobes, that kind of part that's down in the bottom.
It's somewhere in
below
there.
there. That's what we're talking about. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Not that it makes any difference to me.
No.
But that's interesting. Okay. So hormonally speaking, what is happening? I know that there's estrogen and progesterone and testosterone. I know those peak and drop in pretty significant ways throughout the cycle.
Yes.
Where are those peaks and what do they signal?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and man, we could probably have a 2-hour discussion with how that sort of goes.
Surface level, what's happening?
Yes. So basically what you have in the follicular phase or the pre-ovulatory phase or days 1 to 14.
Yep, got it.
And so then those phases will correspond with certain phases of the uterine cycle, and that's the period, which is day 1.
Right.
And also the proliferative phase. Excuse me. And so proliferative is just saying there's changes happening with the endometrium.
Okay.
It's proliferating, it's growing, it's changing theoretically to, get ready for
facilitate.
an embryo implantation, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
So hormonally, everything is building up in that first phase to ultimately save all of its energy for day 14 or day 15 at ovulation.
Got it.
So what you'll see is generally at the start of a period, estrogen's pretty low, progesterone is pretty low. Those are sex hormones. Follicle stimulating hormone is low. The luteinizing hormone, those are lowish.
Okay.
And then as we approach ovulation, there's sort of a surge in those hormones, which trigger the release of the egg.
Oh.
So and then after that, you have kind of the,
it tapers off?
Basically, yes.
Okay.
Now, man, that's a very broad way to look at it. But second half of the cycle, you'll see progesterone is much higher. And that's serving to basically protect the endometrium.
Okay.
And so there's reasons why these things are high and low. And I think maybe we'll unpack it a little bit as we go, just to see kind of what we're where we go.
Laying groundwork so we can understand what is normal, what's supposed to be happening, so that we understand when that's not happening, what's going on, or how that's affecting people. Anyway, okay. So you said the estrogen and progesterone, basically all the hormones, drop at the beginning of the cycle, and then they surge at 14, and they somewhat taper off until they start over again. So is PMS, which is premenstrual syndrome, that's is that a result, that feeling, those issues that women have in that, is that because of the hormonal drops? Is that what's going on?
So the thing with PMS and PMDD is just a more serious version of PMS.
Okay.
And so what happens is you have this normal ebb and flow of hormones. And so if somebody has clinically diagnosed PMDD, let's say, there's not an imbalance and there's not an abnormality with those hormones. There's just an abnormality in the response to those normal levels of hormone.
Okay.
So that's why we mentioned the brain, kind of straight off the top. The biggest thing is just that there's an improper response. There's a hypersensitivity to these sex hormones. And so when we talk about some of the treatments, and Joey will unpack that much further, but that's the kind of the global view. It's like, it's not some hormonal imbalance. You don't have too high of progesterone. You don't have too low of estrogen per se. Your levels are basically right where somebody who doesn't have PMDD is, but there's just something
for whatever
there.
reason, you are hyper subject to the whims of those receptors. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
and in a more traditional sense, there's not believed to be problems with the way that the cycle is progressing in terms of what progesterone and estrogen are doing. When you do start getting into more alternative-based which, functional medicine, some of what we do, our nurse practitioner, et cetera, there does begin to be a little more belief that particularly progesterone can be deficient in certain women. And then what can happen is estrogen, even if it's not high, can become dominant. And so, again, we'll kind of start to deal with some of those things as we go.
Sure.
They are controversial. There will be some, disagreement amongst, again, that's why this is one of those things that has not been solved by any means.
Right.
There is a lot of disagreement among different practitioners. But that's at least just one layer that I wanted to go to. But like Dante said, there is not necessarily a direct link to say, well, if you have PMDD, or even PMS, there's something wrong with your cycle. That is not necessarily true, period.
Okay.
So,
okay.
They're just, again, when you start going into the more alternative route, that becomes more of a thing that they will look for than in a more traditional route, I guess is the way I would put it. But there's no, there's no guarantee that there's actually something wrong with the cycle.